My name is Nate Burns. I'm a sophomore from Boston, Massachusetts, studying economics and finance. This semester, I've been working under the advisement of Dr. Carrie Deck on an experimental project to study the effects of impatience on bargaining situations. This has been a collaborative effort as well with Dr. Charles Thomas over at Clemson University. I'd like to start off with a little bit of context. Bargaining has always been a popular topic in economics because we've always been curious about how people reach agreements when their interests don't exactly align. And of course, we see this play out every day, whether it's haggling over the prices of buying goods, negotiating salary, rent, or a whole host of other situations. And even though the idea of bargaining is pretty intuitive to us because we see it so often, it's still helpful for us to put it into a more formal context so that we can discuss it going forward. We can think of bargaining as a game in which more than one person engage in a negotiation deciding how a sum is to be split. And even if you think about bargaining over the price of a good, you can always boil it down to buyers who have predefined values for what that good is worth, and they're not going to want to pay more than those values, and sellers who have predefined costs for that good, and they're not going to want to sell for any less than those costs. The entire point of bargaining is just to decide how to split that difference. Economic theory tries to predict when agreements will be made, and specifically what agreement should be made, assuming that all players are rational in a bargaining situation. And because we can simplify bargaining into a game like I just described, the subject lends itself pretty well to experimental economics, where we can recreate a microeconomy in a lab setting and compare our results to the models that tell us how people should behave in theory. The lab setting also allows us to control for factors of interest and to potentially disentangle any confounding variables that might otherwise complicate the analysis of bargaining scenarios. Below, I've included some of the lingo that I'm going to use going forward in the presentation. When I talk about bilateral bargaining, I'm referring to the bargaining that takes place between only two players. And on the other hand, you have multilateral bargaining, which takes place between more than two players. The idea of discounting is taking into consideration the fact that there's a cost to passing time. What exactly that cost is varies from person to person, and that's where impatience comes in. Some people are more patient than others, and it's less costly to them to spend long periods of time bargaining because they're in no rush. And others might not be so patient, so their time is more costly. In bargaining games, discounting merely refers to how this cost is imposed on the subjects. And structured versus unstructured, almost all experimental bargaining literature reflects what I'll refer to as structured games. These structured games are marked by the presence of discrete time, like segmented bargaining periods, where players have to make bids in a fashion that's imposed on them by the experiment. Unstructured games don't have these restrictions. So much of the existing literature studies bargaining games in the context of what are known as Rubinstein games. Most experimental work in bargaining, being extensions or adaptations of Rubinstein games, have the following characteristics. They're predominantly bilateral, so that means that all players are equally patient or impatient if we think that discounting factors as representing how costly passing time is to a player. And they all follow an offer-counter-offer structure, so that these games take place in discrete time, where players must follow that predefined flow of bargaining imposed on them by the experiment. It would look something like this off to the right, where you see that player one has to make an offer, and then player two can either accept or reject that offer. And if player two accepts, both of the players receive their profits. And if player two rejects, he then makes a counter offer and the cycle repeats. Each time that cycle repeats is traditionally where discounting would be imposed to reflect that cost of passing time. Now, even though these characteristics simplify the game design, they're not very realistic to real-world bargaining scenarios. In following that, while the main goal of our project is to gather data and use it to see how impatience affects bargaining outcomes in different situations, especially multilateral ones, we're looking to fill other gaps within the state of the literature by combining methodologies in a really novel way. Our focus varies from previous studies in that we're concentrating on impatience that varies from player to player in a multilateral setting. And moreover, I'll talk about this in a minute, we're looking to do this by implementing some unconventional elements into our experimental design, with the hope that it will encourage greater consideration in the future of more realistic bargaining settings in experimental work. And as we just saw in that last slide, much of the existing literature has created these rigid and artificial feeling bargaining structures. And while that often makes it easier to apply this pre-existing theory to those games, at a certain point, it just doesn't provide enough insight to us of what actually happens in the real world, where negotiations occur in continuous time. They rarely have structural constraints, and they always have some risk of ending at any moment before a deal is actually reached. That being said, our experimental design is going to look a little bit like this. We have both multilateral and bilateral treatments. So like I said, a large part of our work is focused on multilateral bargaining, which is less well studied. This is important because we're interested in comparing the effects of inpatients on both the bargaining outcomes between multilateral and bilateral treatments. Furthermore, our game is going to be unstructured. This is where our experiment deviates most from the previous literature, I think. We've designed the experiment specifically so that there is no strict institution limiting the whims of the subjects. They can bid, rebid, and accept offers in continuous time whenever they want, reflecting the freedom that life-realistic bargaining would otherwise allow. And because our experiment is unstructured and continuous time like this, negotiations are going to have an exogenous risk of breakdown. And all that means is that we, outside of the game, are defining some risk that negotiations will terminate at an uncertain point in time for the players. We use this technique, which has really little precedent in experimental bargaining games, to impose the concept of discounting on the players. And if we remember that varying discount rates correspond to varying levels of impatience, intuitively, it makes sense that someone who believes there's a greater probability that bargaining will end at any moment without a deal being made is going to be more anxious to get a deal done sooner, right? But how are we able to translate this probability into our game? This is where the exponential failure distribution comes into play. Given the chance that negotiations will stop at any moment in continuous time, the exponential distribution allows us to model when a player's bargaining horizon might terminate. Mathematically, we can accomplish this by looking at its cumulative distribution function, which gives us the probability that negotiations will last up to some time t. And if we look at this equation here, you can see that in order to back out that time t, we just need to plug in a value for lambda and plug in a random probability value for the CDF function, f of t. Lambda is our discount parameter here. It represents the hazard rate, and as such, it represents the player's level of impatience. This is what makes the exponential distribution distinct from other continuous functions. It has this constant failure rate, so the chance of termination remains the same no matter what point in time we're at in the negotiations. So if you look at the graph I have over here, I've plotted out the CDF functions for two different lambda values. One lambda value is noticeably larger than the other. And if we pretend that we're in a bargaining game and I'm a player, say 1 unit of time into my negotiations, if I have the high lambda value or the high hazard rate, which means I'm less patient, we can see that I have only about a 20% chance of moving forward at least 1 unit in time beyond where I am now. Whereas if I have the lower lambda value, I have an almost 60% chance of moving forward or my negotiations lasting at least 1 more unit in time. In the experiment, after observing the players come to an agreement at some point in time, we'd then be able to go back to each player and tell them whether their bargaining horizon, using that t that we solved for in the equation, was long enough to actually capture that agreement or not, and whether they would walk away with their profits or whether they'd walk away with nothing. As far as implementing our experiment goes, I'm currently in the process of designing a computer program on an experimental social sciences platform called OTREE. I'm able to do the majority of the coding through the integrated development environment PyCharm, and this program will be the medium through which subjects actually bargain. And because these players are going to be bargaining with each other through computers, we don't have to worry about some potentially confounding factors that are associated with seeing the person with whom you're bargaining face to face. The OTREE program will also allow for the experiment to be carried out in a very efficient and cost-effective way for the lab. It's also going to help us collect and organize the data from all the many rounds that we're going to be seeing in the experimentation. Moving forward, we plan to carry out the experiment some point early next semester after we're able to strength test the design in the computer program as necessary. This might include, if we see it needed, a pilot test with a limited subject pool. And then the experiment will actually take place in the TIDE lab here on campus that's housed within the Culverhouse College of Business. This lab takes student volunteers and they're then compensated both for their time and for their earnings within the experimental game. Once we collected the data, I'm really looking forward to seeing what we find and continuing with all of this. So now I'd love to take some questions.
Nate, how have previous experiments implemented variable discount rates between players?
Sure. Well, that's a great question because past experiments with uniform discount rates have largely relied on simply just reducing the amount of money that's being split from round to round of bargaining. And you can think back to the cycles that I referred to in the Rubinstein games slide. You just reduce that amount of money. But with varying discount rates, these same kinds of games had to use intermediary payment units to be able to apply the different discounts. So for example, you could use chips that would be used to bid, and afterwards, those chips would be exchanged for real money. And then this would allow experimenters to just vary the exchange rate from player to player and from round to round to then impose that discounting while they get to hold the sum of the chips constant across the players. We can't do this in our game because our game doesn't have any rounds. It's in continuous time.
Why wouldn't players just immediately split the pie evenly and be fair?
Well, we think that you don't see that in real life, first of all. And you think that in an experimental setting, in a lab setting, that's just some artifact of actually being in the lab. And those might be due to what we call experimenter demand effects, where the players think that the experimenters might want them to be to look like they're acting fairly. And there's a whole bunch of other confounding factors that might be associated with that if you're not taking into account anonymity. But in real life, you don't see players in a bargain try to split that sum evenly because people are selfish and they want to get the best deal possible for them. And we're just trying to look at how that varies based on impatience levels and knowing that you're in a bilateral versus multilateral setting.
Can you explain the intuition behind why you think impatience would be a factor of interest in comparing multilateral versus bilateral bargaining?
Sure. In short, we think that the effects impatience has on bargaining might depend on whether the negotiations are bilateral or multilateral, because the impatience of a buyer or an impatient buyer should be able to play multiple sellers off of each other to then get a better price. And intuitively, you can think of a situation where you're bidding back and forth over a good online with a seller. And if you're really impatient, you spending time bidding is going to be more costly to you. So you'll probably be more willing to just accept a higher price, even if you could negotiate it down over time. But if you now imagine that there are two sellers online selling that exact same good, if they know that you're really impatient and that you're also bidding with another seller, they might change their behavior accordingly, and you might get a better price because of it, despite you being just as impatient. So we're looking out to see how that varies.
Very good. Well, unfortunately, Nate, that's all the time that we have. Congratulations on this research to date, and a special thanks to Dr. Deck for sponsoring the research as well as joining us today. Thank you both.